Okay, there you go, everyone. You can see Dominik now as well. Okay, so over to you, Dominik. I'll give you a 2-minute warning. Did you want a
Perfect.
halfway as well?
No, I have a timer going on here, so I should
Okay,
be okay.
great.
All right. So wonderful. Thank you for inviting me to this. So this is about this is a very brief summary of a talk in my series that I've run here at Oxford. What should educators know? And one of the things that I've discovered over the last year or so, that actually there's a lot of stuff in user interface and user experience studies that we don't know. Just a quick warning, my internet dropped out early, so if it does, I usually am back in about a minute if that happens. But so the key thing, as I said, there are so many lessons about how our users interact with interfaces in different environments, and we can learn from these. And so I have a question for you. Do you agree with this statement? Computers should be easy to use and have intuitive interfaces so that their users shouldn't need a manual or training to understand them. So do you agree with that statement? I'm not going to sort of run a poll or anything, but usually when I run this question, people say, yes, of course, yes, that makes sense. But what if I substitute computers for cars? Well, it starts making a lot less sense all of a sudden. And what about pianos? And so computers are in no way sort of easier systems or less powerful than cars and pianos. So I think we actually need to stop thinking, and that's also the lesson from the UX world. Stop thinking in terms of perfect design or intuitive design. And we just think of the use of interface as a process of learning, and also the design is actually a process of discovery of the learning. And the core metaphor here that I've come across that I like is knowledge gap as opposed to intuition, and starts from the premise that intuitive design is a misleading goal, and it comes from Jared Poole, who wrote a great article about this, and he says actually what we need to look at is knowledge space, and what our users, when they perceive a design as unintuitive, what they're actually seeing is experiencing a knowledge gap between what they know and what they need to know in order to be able to use that interface. So here's for example, some feedback from our users on Canvas, and say it's completely unintuitive, I don't know what to do. But this is the interface of Canvas that they're struggling with. So it's a plus page that seems entirely intuitive, but it turns out the knowledge gap wasn't in the button, but it was they just didn't know why they should add a page, what they should do. So that's kind of an example of how we discovered what the issue is. And so our aim from Jared Poole is to say is that making designs intuitive is actually finding out where the current and target knowledge is. And I would say, so that's our task as designers of all activities, and also as educators, is to think about what is the nature of knowledge people need to solve that, and what is the current knowledge they have, and what are the ways in which we can guide them between them. And these are the 6 areas which I would look at, and this is a précis of an hour-long workshop, so I will only sort of hint at some of these. So affordances, mental models, using idioms instead of metaphors, intermediate versus beginner users, heuristics, design patterns, and zone of proximal capability. So everybody knows affordances. I will not talk about them too much, therefore, it's that sort of property that makes an object seem that we can use it immediately. It's going to present itself to us without conscious deliberation. I wrote about it on the alt blog. And it's the door handle is a typical example of an affordance. You just can grasp it and open the door with it. But for example, a paper timetable has its own affordance. You can see I can circle things, I can see things side by side. But a digital timetable has other affordance. I can search in it. I can find things in a way that I couldn't with just an eye. It goes for different types of digital timetables. So on the left, it shows me when is the bus at this very moment or a particular moment, whereas the other one gives me an overall picture if I'm planning. Books have their affordances. They're easy to hold. They show you the page, and a Kindle have their own affordances. So those are all sort of things. Space we're in also has affordance. So one lecturer said to me about their Zoom lecture, well, why do people laugh at my jokes? They laugh in the lecture room, why not on Zoom? Because they don't see each other. They're not getting the feedback from being with each other in space. And the BBC have run into that when running comedies, and they've actually gone to great lengths to overcome that. And you can actually listen to some of those comedies where they have sort of live Zoom audience. So that's affordances. So it's just how the world is presented to us in a way that we don't have to think about using it. But these things actually are mediated by what has been called mental models. And mental models are the sort of picture you need to have in your head to understand what is actually going on. So for example, people often call it unintuitive. And there are many sort of problems with Teams. But for example, somebody says, how do I turn off when I turn on together mode? How do I turn it off? And it turns out you don't turn it off. You go to, you switch to gallery, switch between gallery and together mode. But if you think of that checkbox that Microsoft puts there as a way of turning things on and off, then you would want to uncheck it. But that's not how it works. You switch, but it's a toggle mode. And so you have to have a sort of a mental image of how these things work. So it can go quite in depth. So for example, if your Wi-Fi isn't working, you need to have a mental image of how the Wi-Fi works. So is it a problem with your Wi-Fi? Is it a problem with your router? Is it a problem with the internet provider? And so on. So those are some, so that's important that we think about what are the big mental pictures people need to have in order to understand. Idioms and metaphors are another example, and there's a new sort of trend of saying thinking idiomatically as opposed to metaphorically about design, and that's just because there are not enough metaphors out there. So this is an ad that Apple ran to explain, okay, our computers make sense. Early Mac OS Macs make sense because they have this clear metaphors, but it breaks down very quickly. So for example, raising hand is really in webinars it's really difficult. So it's easy to you see there's a metaphor of the hand, you click on it, but does it mean that you when the arrow is on there, doesn't mean the right hand is up or that you need to raise your hand. So you need to think in terms of idioms, and those are the sort of things that don't necessarily make sense until you know them, but they're quick to learn and sticky. Words like quick kick the bucket and things like that. And here's an example of an idiom. Steve Jobs demonstrating pinch to zoom. Nothing intuitive about it. You never do it in real work, but you only need to see it once and it immediately makes sense. That's kind of an example of an idiomatic design. Here's another example of an idiom of a booking schedule where you sort of click once, you book the check-in date, click second time, and you book the checkout date. There's nothing in there, and there's nothing sort of intuitive about it, but it's kind of immediately starts making sense. So the next principle is think in terms of intermediate versus beginner users. And they have very different designs, and actually designing should be aimed at intermediate users with routes for beginners to get into it. So those are people who use the interface often. They often need to achieve repeated tasks and so on. They don't want to be reminded about the basics, and they have some underlying mental models. So for example, these are all the door handles in my house, perfectly intuitive. All have different mental models, different ways of working on. I don't struggle with this because I was able. I don't actually have that difficulty. So another example. So I am an intermediate user of those door handles, and so it's important that we sort of think about that. So an anti-design pattern for this is like having long welcome messages on courses, for example. So that's for the beginners. It's for the first time users. But then. For the next 10 weeks, everybody has to see the welcome message when they go check out, once download the file and so on. So that's going to be an example of thinking of intermediate users. Finally, then there are UX heuristics. I won't talk about these, but those are really important. I highly recommend Norman Nielsen Group 10 Heuristics for User Interface Design. An example of that is in Zoom. If I want to leave a breakout room, it also gives me options for ending the meeting for all, which is a really bad idea because people have done that by mistake and the meeting for all couldn't do anything with this. So those are some examples of patterns. I'm not going to go into them. I'm just going to say here's. Yeah, the next thing is that Jacob's law is that users spend most of their time on other sites, which means you should pay attention to what they're expecting. It's an example of running against those expectations. A hand sanitizer bottle that looks very much like a drinking bottle, and leads users down the wrong path. And then to finally, I want to close with this sort of my thinking about what I would call the zone of proximate capabilities, and that comes from the notion of proximal development, but from Vygotsky, and the idea is that users often rely on others to do basic tasks for them. You could ask colleagues, children, neighbors, and this is actually very powerful. We underestimate the power of this and the importance of this. So this is a screenshot of my presentation from my Zoom training, and I've never ever once showed anybody how to do the virtual training, virtual background, because everybody already seemed to know it because they thought it was so cool. They kept asking each other. They found out. So I wasn't telling them because they were as part of a sort of ecosystem of support, of interest, where someone sharing the screen may have been more difficult because it didn't seem to be something they want to ask others about. Here's an example from my friend that I was talking to, and she said, when I first got my Android phone, I didn't know how to answer calls. So because they have to swipe instead of just click on that button. And so what she did, she waited for people to ring, they stopped ringing, and she rang them back for a few days. And she knew that in a day she would be meeting a friend who would explain to her how it works. And that's just how she, for the first 2 days of having that phone, she just simply, she called out, but she could never actually answer calls. So that's an example of somebody sort of thinking holistically about the interface, not just like, what can I do right now? But actually, I have other friends, I have other people, I can solve problems in other ways. And that's why I want to talk about, I want us to remind us that there are these sophisticated networks of people connecting to each other. And they don't very often match up very, very nicely onto the institutional networks. There's a sort of, the rhizome metaphor is very popular here nowadays. There's a, institutional structures are these beautiful pictures with flowers, and then, but underneath we have all those sort of roots that actually make it work. And so that's the users in our user manuals, or we sort of imagine them as such, whereas in practice, they're actually sort of connected to each other. So we need to think,
Dominik.
Sorry?
Oh, just 1 minute left.
Perfect. And so we need to, so just to bring us back to the affordances. And so if we think of affordances as the aspects of the interface that are directly meaningful to the user, they sort of, users can achieve something with them. Well, we need to realize that that meaning is derived from context and the social interaction and also prior experience. And so we need to saturate the environment with meaning-making opportunities. And that we sort of mile us. And that could be things like setting up a learning ecosystem, or we already do those manuals, user guides, but also local people, the user champions, your local guides, help desks, environmental cues, having posters with interface tips. I mean, why not? Communication, having regular emails with sort of, or pop-ups and saying these are some tips, or having also some reinforcement in it. So integrated into instructions. I always tell instructors, don't just put up videos in Panopto. Tell students about all the features of Panopto and have them talk to each other about how they can actually, how they're interfacing with it, how they're getting benefit from some of those features. Because that's, I would say, is really important for people to learn. And finally, is that I would say this is also particularly good for people with additional needs, because we're actually all have a sort of a learning need. We're very busy, tired, or new in a place, and that of course describes us as educators, as students, as people. And so thank you very much. Please do get in touch with me on this email. And just remember, intuition is really a lack of a knowledge gap.
Thank you, Dominik. Wow. Managed to get a lot of content in there. Thank you very much. I have one question, if that's okay. Sorry,
Sure.
Jumping in here. When you said about the using Panopto and the students and kind of, things aren't always intuitive and things like that, do you do any training with your students on how they can use the video software, or with us we use Panopto as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, so for example, in one course we sort of created a guide on how to make the most out of Panopto, and sort of told them. And I've also created and told the students, yes, this is remember, you can listen at higher speed, you can search through Panopto. There's all these hidden features, and the lecturers don't know about them. So we sort of, so that would be something that we would do. Yeah.
Fantastic. Nick or Steve, do you know if there are any questions in the chat for Dominik?
Anonymous asks, should universities limit the number of applications / interfaces students and staff have to interact with?
I would say, well, no. I mean, it's like saying the student. I mean, we just need to sort of acknowledge that people need to learn these things, but give them learning opportunities about them. So, and think about the sort of interactions and levels. So don't just think. My mantra is that never underestimate students' ability not to know how to do something you think is very basic. So always include learning. So for example, when we recently introduced Miro into the course, and we literally had to add 2 hours of just people getting practice learning those interfaces. So it wasn't a question of not adding a new one, a new thing, but it was a question of, okay, here's a new thing. It seems intuitive, quote unquote intuitive, but actually people need to develop those intuitions. They need to close the knowledge gap, and they need to get better at it. So it just takes time. So always build in that time. The same with we just have a new exam system in, and students have an opportunity to do a mock exam, just literally submitting exam stuff, so that they know when they first do it, they've already done it once or twice. And those are some examples of sort of like, again, help people develop those quote unquote intuitions by closing the knowledge gap.
Cool, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominik, as well. We've had a couple of people asking if we could have the slides, or if you'd be willing to share the slides.
Very happy. I'll share them in the team afterwards.
Yeah, if you could send them to me, Dominik. What I'll do is I'll place them in the team with all of the others in a separate folder. But that's very kind. Thank you. I know everyone will appreciate that.